Hello students, welcome to the session. Let's study respiratory system part 1.
System. So these are the parts of the respiratory system. In this diagram you can see. So it continues with the nose, then pharynx, that is nasopharynx, then larynx, then trachea, that is a windpipe, and then bronchus. There are two, right bronchus and left bronchus, and then bronchioles, and then it consists of the lungs.
Respiratory organs, nasal cavity. Air enters nasal cavity through two nostrils. The nasal cavity filters warmth and moistens air before it enters the lungs. The hairs in the nose and mucosa trap dust and bacteria, filtering the incoming air. Second, pharynx or throat, air pharynx through the nasal passage or mouth cavity. Breathing through the mouth loses the advantages of filtering, moistening, and warming of air. The pharynx opens into food tube, that is esophagus, and air tube, that is larynx and trachea. Third is the larynx or voice box. The opening of the pharynx into larynx is called glottis. This is guarded by a cartilaginous flap called epiglottis, which prevents food from entering the larynx. The larynx is elevated during swallowing, closing it against the epiglottis. The larynx is supported by cartilages and contains vocal cords. The vibration of vocal cords by exhaled air produces sound. The two vocal cords are separated by a slit-like opening. During swallowing, the vocal cords come together and close the slit. This further prevents food from entering the trachea. Trachea or windpipe. The trachea is about 11 centimeters in length. It is supported by C-shaped incomplete rings of cartilage which keep the tube open. The trachea is lined by ciliated epithelium that sweeps foreign particles back to the pharynx. Bronchi. At the point where the trachea enters the thoracic cavity, chest cavity, it is divided into right and left bronchi, which enter the lungs. Like trachea, the bronchi are also supported by cartilaginous rings and lined by ciliated epithelium. Lungs. The two lungs are essential organs of respiration. They are soft, spongy, and elastic structures. The lobes, right lung has three lobes and left lung has two lobes. Location, they occupy most of the thoracic cavity. Each lung is conical structure with its base resting on the diaphragm and apex directed towards the neck. The alveoli, with each inhalation, air passes by way of bronchial tree to alveoli. Air and alveolar sac is made up of simple squamous epithelium surrounded by blood capillaries. Gas exchange occurs between air in the alveoli and blood in the capillaries. Oxygen diffuses across the alveolar and capillary walls to enter the bloodstream, while carbon dioxide diffuses from blood across the walls to enter the alveoli. The alveoli must stay open to receive the inhaled air if gas exchange is to occur. The alveoli are lined with surfactant, a film of the lipoprotein that lowers the surface tension and prevents them from closing. The lungs collapse in newborn babies who lack this film, and condition is called infant respiratory distress syndrome and now treatable by surfactant replacement therapy. Mechanism of breathing is depending mainly on their habitat and level of organization. So lower vertebrates like sponges, cylindrids, and flatworms, so they exchange oxygen with simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworms, moist cuticle. Insects, network of tubes, that is tracheal tubes to transport atmospheric air within the body. Aquatic arthropods and the mollusks. So special vascularized structures called gills are present. Vertebrates like fishes use gills. Reptiles, birds, and mammals respire through lungs. Amphibians like frogs respire through their moist skin also. Respiration involves following 5 steps. Breathing or pulmonary ventilation, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2 rich alveolar air is released out. Diffusion of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide across alveolar membrane. Transport of gases by blood. Diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and tissues. Utilization of oxygen by cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of CO2. Mechanism of breathing movement in man, the ventilation of the lungs, that is inspiration and expiration, is brought about by movement of ribs and sternum and the diaphragm. The ribs are attached to the thoracic vertebrae behind and to the sternum in front. Attached to the ribs are the intercostal muscles. Diaphragm is the muscular plate-like partition between thoracic and abdominal cavities. On an average, the healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of air involved in breathing movements can be estimated by using spirometer, which helps in clinical assessment of pulmonary function. The first is diaphragm. So in inspiration, it contracts and flattens. Expiration, it relaxes and moves intercostal muscles. In inspiration, they contract. In expiration, they relax. The ribs and sternum moves upwards and outwards. In expiration, moves downward and inward. Now, thorax volume in inspiration increased, expiration decrease. Air pressure in inspiration decrease, in expiration increase. Now, tidal volume is the volume of air moving in and out of lungs with each normal breath is called tidal volume. It is about 500 ml. Vital capacity. The lungs are filled to maximum capacity by enforced inspiration. The volume of air 4 to 6 liters in the lungs is called vital capacity. The forced inspiration usually increases the volume of air beyond the tidal volume by 2900 ml, and that amount is called inspiratory reserve volume. We can increase the amount of air expired by contracting the abdominal and internal intercostal muscles. This is so-called expiratory reserve volume. This is about 1400 ml of air. Vital capacity is the sum of tidal plus inspiratory reserve plus expiratory reserve volume. Residual volume, even after enforced expiration, some air always remain in lung. This is about 1.5 liter. This is called residual air. The residual air ensures that some carbon dioxide always remain in our circulation with each breath. This air is not as useful for gas exchange because it has been depleted of oxygen. In some lung diseases such as emphysema, the residual volume builds up because the individual has difficulty emptying the lungs. This means that the vital capacity is reduced because the lungs have more residual volume. Exchange of gases, oxygen, atmospheric air 159, alveoli 104, blood deoxygenated 40, blood oxygenated 95, tissues 40, carbon dioxide, atmospheric air zero point 0.3, alveoli 40, blood deoxygenated 45, blood oxygenated 40, and tissues 45. Alveoli are the primary sites of exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissue. Factors that affect the rate of diffusion. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in tissues by simple diffusion, mainly based on pressure concentration gradient. Second, solubility of the gases and the thickness of the membrane. So diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers. First, thin squamous epithelium of the alveoli. Second, endothelium of the alveolar capillary. Third, basement membrane, basement substance that is composed of thin basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells of capillaries in between them. Concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood, blood to tissues, and for the CO2 it is in opposite direction, that is from tissues to blood and blood to alveoli. As the solubility of carbon dioxide is 20 to 25 times higher than that of oxygen, the amount of carbon dioxide that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher compared to that of oxygen. All factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to tissues and that of CO2 from tissues to alveoli. Transport of gases. Blood is the medium of transport for oxygen and carbon dioxide. So first, oxygen transport. About 97% of oxygen is transported by RBCs in the blood. The remaining 3% of oxygen is carried in dissolved state through the plasma. After oxygen entering the blood in the lungs, it enters red blood cells and combines with iron portion of hemoglobin. the pigment in red blood cells. Hemoglobin is remarkably suited to the task of transporting oxygen because it both combines with and releases oxygen. The higher concentration of oxygen in the alveoli plus the slightly higher pH and slightly cooler temperature causes hemoglobin to take up oxygen and become oxyhemoglobin HbO2. Lower concentration of oxygen in tissues plus the slightly lower pH and slightly warmer temperature in tissue causes hemoglobin to release oxygen and become deoxyhemoglobin. Every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of oxygen to tissues under normal physiological conditions. Carbon dioxide transport. Every 100 ml of deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli. Nearly 20 to 25% of CO2 is transported by RBCs, where 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of CO2 is carried in dissolved state through plasma. After diffuses into blood and CO2 the tissues, it enters the red blood cells. A small amount is taken up by hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin. Most of the combine with water, forming carbonic acid H2CO3. The carbonic acid dissociates to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The release of these hydrogen ions explains why blood in systemic capillaries has lower pH than blood in pulmonary capillaries. The difference in pH is slight because globin portion of hemoglobin combines with excess hydrogen ions and become reduced hemoglobin. Bicarbonate ions are carried in plasma because they diffuse out of RBC and go into plasma. Most of the carbon dioxide in blood is carried as bicarbonate ion. The bicarbonate ion diffuse out of RBC, chloride ion diffuse into them. This so-called chloride shift maintains the electrical balance between plasma and red blood cell. In pulmonary capillaries, the reverse reaction occurs. Bicarbonate combines with hydrogen to form carbonic acid. With this time, split into CO and diffuses out of blood into alveoli. The following equation. Regulation of respiration. Normally, adults have a breathing rate 12 to 20 ventilations per minute. Nervous input. A specialized center present in medulla region of brain called pulmonary rhythm center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in pons region of brain called pneumotaxic center can moderate the functions of the respiratory rhythm center. Chemical input. The respiratory center is directly sensitive to level of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions H plus CO. When they rise due to cellular respiration, the respiratory center increases the rate and depth of breathing. The center is not affected directly by low oxygen level. When the concentration of oxygen decreases, these bodies communicate with the respiratory center and rate and depth of breathing increase. Disorders of respiratory system. So they are asthma, emphysema, and occupational respiratory disorders. Asthma is a disease of bronchi and bronchioles that is marked by wheezing, breathlessness, and sometimes a cough and excretion of mucus. The airways are unusually sensitive to specific irritants, which can include wide range of allergens such as pollen, animal dander, dust, cigarette smoke, and industrial fumes. Even cold air can be an irritant. When exposed to irritant, the smooth muscle in the bronchioles undergoes spasm. It now appears that chemical mediators given off by immune cells in the bronchioles cause the spasm. Most asthma patients have some degree of bronchial inflammation that reduces the diameter of the airways and contributes to the seriousness of the attack. Asthma is not curable, but it is treatable. Special inhalers can control the inflammation and hopefully prevent an attack. Second, emphysema is a chronic and incurable disorder in which alveoli are distended and their walls damaged so that surface area available for gas exchange is reduced. Emphysema is often preceded by chronic bronchitis. Air trapped in the lungs leads to alveolar damage and noticeable ballooning of the chest. The elastic recoil of the lungs is reduced so not only are the airways narrowed but the driving force behind the expiration is also reduced. The victim is breathless and may have a cough. Because the surface area for gas exchange is reduced, less oxygen reaches the heart and brain. Even so, the heart works furiously to force more blood through the lungs, and increased workload on the heart can result. Lack of oxygen to the brain can make the person feel depressed, sluggish, and irritable. Before therapy can begin, the patient must stop smoking. Then, exercise, drug therapy, supplemental oxygen, and surgery may relieve the symptoms and possibly slow the progression of emphysema. Occupational respiratory disorders in certain industries, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation leading to fibrosis, proliferation of fibrous tissue, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks. To summarize, cells utilize oxygen for metabolism and produce energy along with substances like carbon dioxide, which is harmful. First, we have a well-developed respiratory system comprising two lungs and associated air passages to perform their function for the transport of oxygen to the cells and for removal of carbon dioxide from there. Second mechanism, the first step in respiration is breathing, by which atmospheric air is taken in, inspiration, and the alveolar air is released out, expiration. Exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between deoxygenated blood and alveoli, transport of these gases throughout the body by blood, exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the oxygenated blood and tissues, and utilization of oxygen by the cells. Cellular respiration are the other steps involved. Inspiration and expiration are carried out by creating pressure gradients between atmosphere and alveoli with help of specialized muscles, intercostal and diaphragm. Volumes of air involved in these activities can be estimated with the help of spirometer and are of clinical significance. Third, exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the alveoli and tissues occur by diffusion. Rate of diffusion is dependent on partial pressure gradient of oxygen, PO2, and CO2, that is PCO2, their solubility as well as thickness of diffusion surface. These factors in our body facilitate diffusion of oxygen from alveoli to the deoxygenated blood as well as from oxygenated blood to the tissues. The factors are favorable for the diffusion of carbon dioxide in opposite direction, that is from tissues to alveoli. For transport of gases, oxygen is transported mainly as oxyhemoglobin in the alveoli where PO2 is higher. O2 gets bound to hemoglobin, which is easily dissociated at the tissues where PO2 is low and PCO2 and H plus concentration are high. Nearly 70% of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate HCO3 minus with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. In the tissues where PCO2 is high, it gets bound to blood where the alveoli where PCO2 is low and PO2 is high. It gets removed from the blood. Regulation. Respiratory rhythm is maintained by respiratory center in medulla region of brain, a pneumotaxic center in the pons region of the brain, and chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter respiratory mechanism. Disorders are asthma, emphysema, occupational respiratory disorders.
Hope you find this session useful for your understanding and for your exams. Thank you.